You're listening to We Knew the Moon with Dee Safier, an empath who started a podcast to explore the universe, spirituality, and all things witchy woo-woo. Don't forget to check out the website weknewthemoon.co.uk for all your I do what I want and the moon made me do it merch, whichever excuse you prefer to use for all of your life choices. Hello, this is Dee and this is We Knew the Moon. I'm joined again by Michelle. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Dee.
This is Michelle Alderson from Heartfelt Illustrations. If you've listened to our past episode on Wicca and Gerald Gardner, you would have heard that Michelle and I met when I needed a logo done. Her link will be in the show notes. And she, like us all, has got a bit of a fascination with all things spiritual. Michelle, as you will hear in a moment when she starts speaking, is Northern. And so when I sent her a list of possible subjects that she could cover on an episode, one of them stood out, didn't it, Michelle?
It did. Shall I tell you about it?
Yes, tell me.
The Pendle Witch Trials.
Oh, so exciting. So it happened near your hometown, is that it?
Well, when I was little, I was actually born and raised in Bradford and Leeds area. And this area that we're talking about, Pendle, is actually in Lancashire, just over the border. So it was an area that I was really familiar with. We've been on days out around that area and specifically to Pendle Hill many, many times as a child and as growing up. So we touched on it a little bit, the Pendle Witch Trials, in episode in season 2. We had an episode on Witch, and we talked a little bit about the history of witchcraft. I mentioned it in passing. I can't wait to hear all about it from someone who grew up in the shadow of it. Everybody in the north of England, in Lancashire especially, knows all about Pendle Hill. And actually something that I didn't realise, but when I looked into this, the Pendle Witch Trials were actually linked to the Salem Witch Trials. And they believed that one was not causal, but actually potentially it was the effect of the Pendle Witch Trials that caused the Salem Witch Trials later on.
Because the Pendle Witch Trials happened like 100 years earlier or something, didn't they?
They did, but it was based on a lot of the things that happened in the Pendle Witch Trials and a lot of the people that were looking into it and reading around it. When it came to the Salem Witch Trials, they were drawing a lot on the information from Pendle.
It doesn't surprise me that the witch hunters would draw on information from 100 years previously to make decisions on whether people live or die. Before we started recording, you actually told me something that I thought was just a bit spooky about the date.
I did. Today we're recording on the 18th of August, 2021. And actually the Pendle Witch Trials began on the 18th of August, 1612. 509 years ago to the very day.
This is a tribute to those poor people that had to suffer just terrible indignities, which you will now tell us all about.
Absolutely. So I'll tell you a little bit about Pendle itself. I'll tell you a little bit about the area and the history. And also I'm going to take you back even further a little bit to talk about what we call the Cunning Women. And then I'm going to tell you about the trial itself. The story of the Pendle Witches begins in 1612 in a little village, an area called Pendle Hill, and we just said was in Lancashire, in the northern part of England. It was and still is today a rural community, and at that time it was quite cut off, known for its wildness, known for its heathenism, known for its distance from any what they would call civilization. If you imagine today, it would be just a few hours on a train, but then it would be hours and hours, possibly days of riding a horse away from London, where the seat of the monarchy, religion itself, the laws of the land were. So it's quite some distance from it. And so the people in that area wouldn't have had much contact with London and the laws of the land of the day. So that's the main thing to bear in mind. But the other thing was these were really, really harsh times, especially in areas like the cut-off areas, especially up north. Poverty was rife. Eking out a living was a daily struggle for lots of people. Mortality rates were really high. There was child illness and death were extremely common before children wouldn't necessarily get into adulthood. So we're talking about times where just life itself was hard and grueling. And death and illness were huge blooming worries in the lives of people, especially the poor. So scientific thinking at that time was very much in its infancy. The supposed civilised thoughts and ideas had not yet reached these communities like Pendle Hill. So many residents still were practising old ways. They had millennia-long held beliefs that were often based around superstitions and rituals. And as we were saying before on other podcasts, around the cycles of the natural world, observing the moon, the sun, the seasons. And remember, they didn't always understand why things were happening. So they had to sort of postulate explanations. It was common for most areas like Pendle Hill to have what was referred to as cunning women, as I mentioned earlier. Now, cunning meant, it was an Old English word and it means knowledge. So basically, women who know things, wise women. It was common that most places had what was called these cunning women, and they served their community. And in 1612, Pendle Hill actually had two self-identifying cunning women working in competition with one another in the village.
Oh, were they rivals?
Rivals, business rivals. But it's believed that they weren't just business rivals, they were possibly connected by marriage. So there's kind of an idea that these two families, each headed by cunning women, were actually related by marriage as well. But they were working in competition with each other.
Come on, women, work together. Let's raise each other up.
I suppose that's what I'm going to come on to say a bit later on. So these two cunning women that were working in business rivalry with each other, they were in their 80s, the pair of them, both of them frail, and both of them were the widowed heads of their families. So the first lady was called Elizabeth Southerns, and she was also known locally as Old Demdike. I'm guessing that was either her craft name or her working name. These two ladies were in their 80s, Dee, so we're talking about a time when, like we just said, that illness and death was ever present. So these ladies have made it. Maybe there was some sort of term of endearment in the Old Demdike. The first lady of the first family, the cunning lady, she was called Elizabeth Southerns, Old Demdike, and she lived in a rundown home which was called Malkin Tower. Now, it sounds grand, doesn't it, Dee? But actually, the Old English word Malkin means shit. So,
right, it does not sound grand anymore.
It doesn't. No, not grand at all. So it would have been a very humble place to live and known locally as Shit Tower. And she lived in Malkin Tower with her widowed daughter, Elizabeth Device, and Elizabeth Device's 3 children. She had 3 children living with her at the time. She may have had more, I don't know, but at the time of the trial, she was living with 3 of her children. James Device, Alison Device, and Jeanette Device. And Jeanette was the youngest at just age 9. And she was an illegitimate child. She was born 3 years after her mother's husband had died.
Right.
So possibly an untenable position in the family. Later on in the story, she's quite key to the trials, and possibly she was a factor in the downfall of her family later on. So there was that family. So there's Old Demdike, her daughter, and her daughter's children. And then
the Shit Tower family, we'll call them.
In the Shit Tower family, unfortunate name. And then the second family, the second cunning lady that was working in competition with them was Anne Whittle, and she was known as Old Chattox. Again, the old thing, I don't know whether it was just her local name or whether it was reverence for her being in her 80s, but she was believed to be blind, and she lived with her daughter, her adult daughter, Anne Redfern. Now, both of these elderly cunning women had been practising their profession, their cunning woman profession, for several decades in Pendle. So they were earning money for their magical services. So trading in herbal medicines and treatments, working as midwives, possibly creating chants and charms, spells perhaps. And they might not have used the word spells, but sort of nice words, trinkets. But it's also thought that they were maybe begging and extorting on the side as a sort of a sideline. So this is where the rivalry comes in, because I think the story goes that each of them would be saying that their medicine was better and worked better for this, and I've got a better love spell, and no, you don't want theirs, you want mine. And so I think there was kind of an ongoing competition, but what it kind of meant was perhaps the customer wasn't always told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Such a dangerous time to be spreading rumours about people.
Absolutely. There wasn't just maybe bad feeling between these two cunning women and their families, but there was perhaps bad feeling between their customers as well. And these were women and families living on the fringes of society, hand to mouth. So not really planning ahead, I'm guessing, just trying to make a living. But the thing I wanted to tell you about, actually, Dee, was cunning women themselves. Because cunning women, they weren't new in 1612. They've been around since the 5th century in the villages and towns in Britain. It turns out that they were really highly respected, but also sort of feared and dubious characters as well. Women who worked at the crossroads of life and death, so healing the sick, helping the dying to pass and the new to be born. They were said to be able to protect and locate lost items. This was a particular key skill. You know, if somebody had lost something they wanted found, you would go to your local cunning woman and she would put together some concoction or some charm or some words, and then you'd go away and hopefully that would help to find these items. All of these things were really key to their role. But the main thing that I found out about cunning women were that they were believed to be the earliest physicians, doctors, surgeons.
We should have an episode just on cunning women.
When I looked into it, I found out the most interesting things. And like I said, they were believed to be some of the earliest skilled physicians, some of them with surgical knowledge as well as medicinal. So not only using plants and herbs and things around them to create medicines for particular ailments, but also they found 5th century graves of these supposed cunning women. They had their tools buried with them, and a lot of them had surgical tools buried with them. So sort of implying that these tools were integral to their craft as well. We've come a long way since then. Medicine has progressed, as we know, like lots of things have done, like religion itself along the journey to more male-centred profession. But it would seem that it began with women.
How cool is that?
It's absolutely cool. And here's something that's going to blow your mind even more, Dee. The very first recorded graves of cunning women were in a tiny little village called, spelt Twice. Sounds like it should say twitchy, but it's witchy.
Ooh,
absolutely.
What?
And they believe the word witch has its actual origins in the 5th century with these cunning women. And one of the theories is that word has travelled down through with cunning women as descendants of basically the very first cunning women, the very first physicians who were working with this craft.
Did you find out where the town is?
It's in Gloucestershire, I think, and Twice, the whole area, it's the area where Stonehenge is. Really? The very first cunning women who were from witchy area, that word travelled down to, we're getting back now down to old Demdike and old Chattocks who were cunning women, and the word used for those women, now being used as an insult, was witch. But unfortunately for old Chattocks and old Demdike and the like, times had significantly changed, and respect for the cunning women themselves had really shifted. So,
spoiler alert, this doesn't end well for them, does it?
No, absolutely not. So basically, we're now back in 1612, and like I was saying, times have significantly altered, and being a cunning woman, being a witch, was now extremely dangerous, and the word witch itself had been reframed from once previously being a word of respect for a very skilled profession, is now being used as an insult to locate and demonize a group of people who are still working in those, I suppose, those old arts.
Or accuse them of that if they want to get rid of just, again, business rivals, love rivals, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't necessarily need to be witches, did they?
No. And unfortunately, this does come into this story significantly. Just to understand the story of the Pendle Witches better, we need to maybe look at just some of the history running up to 1612. So as we said, Cunning Women had been reframed, relabelled as witches, and that word that was previously respected was now used as an insult. We need to look at what was happening religiously and politically at the time. Now, by 1612, the Reformation was very well established. And so that was the time when the religion of the time, Catholicism, was being eroded, being removed, being destroyed, obliterated basically from England and Britain itself. In 1612, again, this was being reframed and thought to be based as a demon-based religion. That religion itself was also being reframed at the same time.
I mean, for hundreds of years, it was even dangerous to be the wrong kind of Christian.
It was equally risky to be a Catholic in 1612 as it was to be a cunning woman, or as they called them, a witch. In 1612, England was being ruled by the Scottish King James I. He was the son of the Catholic Queen, Mary, Queen of Scots, who'd been killed herself by her cousin. But James I had only been king for 9 years by 1612, and under his rule, England was now fiercely Protestant, so Church of England, and Catholicism had been outlawed sometime before, but it was really now not wanted. If you were Catholic, you were an heretic as well. Yeah. You weren't welcome. The ideas weren't welcome, and they were outlawed as well. So any nonconformists to the new religion were considered heretics, which it would have included Catholics, it would have included cunning women, it would have included anybody who didn't conform to the new religion of the Church of England. And harsh punishments were being doled out for those not towing the line. Now, the weird thing about this, though, was James I was actually a really paranoid conspiracy theorist. He had a damaged childhood, obviously. Both of his parents had been murdered at separate occasions, but basically by the time he was a young child, he was an orphan. So he already had lots of issues himself. But he was really obsessed with the idea of witches and demons and dark forces, and that they had some sort of effect on his life. He really thought that he was being plotted against. And you've got to remember as well, just prior to the Pendle Witch Trials, there was the gunpowder plot. And that was intended to kill him.
That's going to make you a bit paranoid, isn't it?
Yeah. He was already paranoid before that. He was really obsessed with, especially Scottish witches. He already had this idea that they were out to kill him and destroy his family. When the gunpowder plot occurred, and it was a group of Catholics who'd tried to blow him, I think this just cemented in his mind that they were in it together, basically, and that he feared for his life. Now, what I didn't know until I looked up this was, in 1612, some of the gunpowder plotters were still at large, believed to have fled to the north.
Oh, my God. I mean, so they would, because like you said, the north was like...
Right. He had his eye on it. He was really looking to the north to find the people that he believed were responsible for trying to hurt him. He believed the area was full of these nonconformists and the Catholic terrorists, as he referred to them, and witches. So he was hell-bent. This is what he wanted to do, was to rid the country, not just of Catholics, but of witches, cunning women, nonconformists, anybody who didn't agree, because he basically feared that he was going to die if he didn't find and catch them all.
I mean, this is what happens when you have no mental health services and facilities and absolute power. Right?
Absolute power at the time, yeah. So a point to note here is that the area of Pendle Hill particularly, as well as vast amounts of the north of England, actually remained loyal to Catholicism even after the Reformation. And in many places, Pendle particularly, the old traditions had been seamlessly combined with the ritual and ceremony of Catholicism and Catholic worship.
We talk about that a lot, don't we? About how to help people convert and introduce this new religion of Catholicism, they adopted and absorbed a lot of pagan rituals, celebrations and so forth, because it made it easier to convert, if you still get your parties, right? So Yule became Christmas and Ostara became Easter.
Yeah, there was blurring the lines between them. The area of Pendle was considered completely lawless, filled with nonconformists and heathens. So it was a real area of concern to James I. He obviously wanted to deal with that area. But 19 years before the witch trials took place, he'd actually published a book called Demonology. This is before he became king. This is before he became king in England, I should say. He was king in Scotland at the time. Like I said, obsessed with witches, thinking everybody's out to get him. And he wrote a book called Demonology. And basically, this was a book about the nature of hell and its beings, how to find them, what they look like. Yeah, how to find them. And this book was the very first mention of something called witch marks, which were used in the trials. So James I
kind of invented them?
Possibly, i.e. places where the devil can suckle. These were actually used to look at ladies, people's bodies. There were some males accused of witchcraft, but mostly women, to look for these marks upon the bodies, and that would be evidence of their guilt.
From memory, they could be, not very many people have an extra nipple, but it happens, but also like moles and tags and just basically things like, if you wanted to label someone as a witch, it seemed like a pretty easy way to do it, right? Because we've all got some weird lump or bump somewhere, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Have you got a witch's mark?
Have I got a witch's mark? Yeah. I've got a birthmark on my head, quite a large one. So I would have definitely, you probably can't see it under my hair, but
I can't see it on Zoom.
I've got one that travels through my hairline. So absolutely.
For sure.
So this is all before he actually even becomes king, and before the gunpowder plot. So he's a man who's really seriously worried about this.
I would have thought they'd have some kind of psych evaluation before someone becomes king of a country. But
maybe they would need a cunning woman.
Catch-22.
Absolutely. And this comes after other laws passed by Elizabeth I, the Witches Act. There was also other publications, and we all know of the very famous one, the Malleus Maleficarum, that was written in 1497. Again, another publication all about finding witches.
And again, hundreds of years before this happened. So
absolutely. So this is a long-standing reframing of basically people who they've deemed not towing the line. So they're reframing what once would be respected knowledge as, just basically demonising. And that's the only word I can really think of. And then in 1604, just 8 years before the Pendle Witch Trials, James actually puts it into law. He puts into law what is written in his book, and he says in law that should it be proved that harm was done by witchcraft, the charge is treason and death is the punishment.
So that's the first time it became a legal issue.
A legal issue. He lays it down in law, and this word proof is a really dodgy, kind of tricky concept, because remember, there's no forensics, no CCTV, no fingerprinting, no evidence collecting like we would think of now. Basically, evidence was allowed to be word of mouth. It was allowed to be telling of a tall tale. In this case, as we'll later on find out, it's allowed to be a business rival saying about another business rival, or a child saying about anybody that they've seen. This exception, especially around child testimony, was made particularly for witch trials. So even at the time, they thought it were a bit dodgy having a child give evidence, but not in the case of witch trials.
Oh, that's so creepy.
So the scene is set, isn't it? Okay. Yeah. So here we are, we're in 1612. The law is in place. We've got all these publications. We've got the reframing of the women, the cunning women. And then King James orders every justice of the peace, which are basically local magistrates, in every city, town and dwelling in England to make a list. And on this list was to include what he called recusants, people who are not going to Church of England. Each justice of the peace would go around all the houses, and they would go into the churches, and they would write down everybody who wasn't attending.
Because that's the thing, even if you were Protestant, you could still get in the shit for not going to church enough, right?
Absolutely. Everybody, even, like you said, even if you were Church of England, and you still had to go to church, and there were punishments if you didn't. But you were in a really dodgy position if you were a Catholic, if you were non-traditional religion, if you were a cunning woman, even if you were a Protestant and then working on your profession of being a cunning woman, you were still in a really precarious position.
I mean, I do even remember accusations of people being in church, so being Protestant, Church of England, going to church but not being enthusiastic enough while singing the hymns or stuff like that. Like,
falling asleep.
Weren't safe. Yeah, exactly.
Not being able to recite a particular prayer or whatever was deemed that you weren't paying enough attention. So these were all put into place, and you can see the slow drip, drip, drip. We can see it building up here, can't we? Mm-hmm. So we've got Old Demdike and we've got Old Chattocks and their families, and you know they're going to be on this list, because they're working in professions that were deemed outside of what was allowed to happen.
They're low-hanging fruit, are they not?
The Justice of Peace for Pendle was a man called Roger Nowell. He lived in a lovely house. He was a wealthy royalist and really loyal to the king and to the New English Church. He was looking for promotion.
Very keen to write this list in this case, yeah.
I don't think he perhaps had a problem with the list.
No.
Then, on the 21st of March, 1612, Roger Nowell, the Justice of the Peace, was asked to investigate a complaint made by John Law, who was a peddler from Halifax. He basically travelled around the area with a little bag selling. He basically sold things as peddlers do. So it might have involved tiny items, cloths, or whatever, household things. Now, John Law claimed he'd been injured by witchcraft. Obviously not killed, but definitely harmed by witchcraft. And he said he was harmed by Alison Device, who was the granddaughter of Old Demdike, the ones who live in Malkin Tower.
Shit Tower, yeah.
Okay. He claimed he was injured by Alison Device. Now, it said he was making his way through Trawden Forest near Pendle Hill, and he had his little bag of wares to sell when he was approached or passed by Alison Device. She asked for some pins. These were handmade and expensive items that they were known to have been used in magical rituals, basically in cunning medicine. They were also used around the house. Now, John Law apparently refused. He refused to help Alison Device. He refused to open his bag, saying that she was begging, not buying. So reportedly, he called her a thief. We don't know what happened. There was only them two there. But he wouldn't give her the pins, he wouldn't sell her the pins, he wouldn't open his bag. And so she, by her own testimony, cursed him, called out for him to be lamed. So she basically insulted him and said, I hope you, whatever. Possibly he knew the family, possibly he knew their profession, possibly he'd met her before on the road, possibly he'd sold her something before and she'd never paid. There were so many scenarios that we just don't know. Mm-hmm. But by her own testimony, she said she cursed him and she asked for him to be lamed. He apparently then took a few more steps, but then he collapsed to the ground and he couldn't get up. Now, by all reports, he experienced lameness just on one side of his body. His speech was slurred. He's had a stroke, Dee. This was a man that was not elderly, but he wasn't young. He did have adult children. He obviously had a tiring job where he walked around the county selling from a bag. He wouldn't have had a lot of money himself. He's
just been agitated with an argument.
Exactly. He could have been agitated. Now, the words can't cause the stroke or the illness, but perhaps she stressed him. Perhaps he got so stressed and agitated and anxious that it did occur. John Law, this peddler, he made a complaint to the Justice of the Peace and said that he believed he'd been harmed by witchcraft, by the words that this young girl, she was, I think, in her teenage years, had said to him. So this was his complaint, and actually the local doctor agreed. So
yeah, but the doctor probably thought these cunning women were like also his rivals, right?
Competition, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. There's a lot going on in this story, really. Now, later on this week, John Law's son, Abraham Law, made an official complaint. So it was complained about And then the son got involved and made an official complaint, which forced the hand of the local justice of the peace then. So he had to do something about it. Now, he said his father was still bedbound. He'd been carried to a local inn and he was still bedbound and he was still ill. They said it was lasting. This curse was lasting and he was still ill. Now, the story goes that Alison felt so terrible about this incident that she went to visit John Law at his bedside, where she confessed to her witchcraft and begged for his forgiveness. She really, really believed that she had done this, that he was sick because she'd cursed him. And she was super sorry, apparently, and she really took responsibility. She said, it's my fault. I did it. I cursed him. It's the witchcraft. But you see, that's where the problem began, because if she'd have just stopped there, this might have been different, but she didn't stop there, because whilst confessing, she spoke about her family, Old Demdike at Malkin Tower, and she said her grandmother was also a witch, i.e. a cunning woman, and made charms and did witchcraft and made medicines and things. So she said all these things, and I think in her confession she thought she was saying, it was me, it must have been me, because this is who I am.
Yeah.
So she felt absolutely awful.
And she was young, you said? She was like teenager?
She was a teenager, yeah.
Aww.
So, and remember, her dad was not alive. Her family were trying to make a living, so she obviously felt bad enough to say it was her fault. So after the Justice of the Peace had obviously got involved, he had to deal with that. So on the 30th of March, 1612, he didn't just bring Alison in front of him, he brought her whole family, including the grandma, Old Demdike, and questioned them as well. The young teenager said, my grandma's a witch, we're a witchy family basically, this is what we do for a living. But obviously we know that was dangerous, and we also know there's different elements taking place here. There's the rivalry between the two businesses, there's the doctor, the official line. And so Old Demdike, when she was asked about her witchcraft, she in turn accused her business rivals and her neighbours. Old Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern, and she said they were witches too.
I'm not going to be lighter on you just because you get more witches involved.
Well, we don't know whether that was promised.
Maybe.
You don't know what was promised. You don't know whether they said, look, name some other people and we will go lighter on you, or name other people and we'll take their business off them and then you'll be the only one here. We do know that they counter-accused. So aside from this business rivalry, it's thought that there was actually long-standing bad feeling between these two families. Like I said, I think they were related by marriage at some level as well. But there was talk of one family blackmailing the other family and one family paying out grain or something yearly to the other family, and one year it hadn't been paid, and then the father of the family died, which they associated together. So we've got now both families in front of the Justice of the Peace, and both of them now talking about witchcraft and who does what and when. On the 2nd of April, 1612, Old Demdike, Old Chattox, her daughter Anne Redfern, and Alison Device, who seemingly started all this with the peddler on the road, they were marched 43 miles to Lancaster Castle by foot to await trial for witchcraft. Now, prison is obviously not a great place to be, but at that time it was horrific, and a lot of people actually died awaiting trial because the conditions were so awful. However, it was even worse if you were accused of witchcraft, because they were kept in really overcrowded places because they were witches. They were deemed dangerous from the outset, so not kept with others, and the space, which is still, you can go see today at Lancaster Castle, a tiny little cell that lots of people were kept in at the same time. Filthy, rats, damp, cramped, neglected of food, and believe it or not, you had to pay for your own food while you were in there. How do you do that if you're not out earning? You were relying on your family bringing food to you. That's 43 miles walk for you to bring food for your family. Yeah. Systematically deprived of sleep, and basically no comforts whatsoever, no change of clothes, no toilets. And worse than that, on top of all that, horrifically tortured to get confessions. Now, some of these tortures, I mean, they're awful.
They're so creative in their evilness, right?
Creative in, I don't even want to discuss the disgustingness of it because it's so awful. The treatment was horrendous. And they got confessions.
Yeah, of course they did.
So, of course they did. So after all this, you know, after they've walked 43 miles, after they've been tortured, after they've been sleep deprived, after they've been starved, standing in their
living
own...
in their own body waste.
Exactly.
And everyone else's,
Funnily enough, they would often confess. It's beyond all current belief, isn't it? And remember, amongst these two families are these two 80-odd-year-old ladies, one of them blind. They're in their 80s. And now we'd be horrified, wouldn't we? We'd be absolutely horrified. And any confessions that came out of it would be disallowed. But then it was seen as the way to get a confession. And not only just the way to get a confession, but what they said under those conditions was seen as they finally got the truth from them. And that would be used as evidence.
Yeah.
I think it's really important here to remember that the confessions were not given freely and likely not in a sound mind. Would any of us be in a sound mind after that?
No.
The contents and the details of the confessions have got to be irrelevant to the story, basically. All we need to understand is, under those conditions, they confessed to witchcraft. So here we are. We've got these 4 people imprisoned, and it's now the holy period of Lent whilst they're in there and whilst they're awaiting trial. Good Friday fell 8 days later on the 10th of April, 1612. And now, on this day, according to later trial testimony, a meeting or a gathering of sorts took place at Malkin Tower, the ship tower, home of old Demdike and a family. And the meeting was organised by old Demdike's daughter, Elizabeth Device, and mother of Alison Device.
Mm-hmm.
Her mother and her child are in horrible conditions, and so she organises a meeting at the house along with her son, James Device, who unfortunately is alleged to have stolen a sheep to be killed and eaten and distributed at this gathering.
Oh, well, that's not going to help, is it?
That ain't going to help, but they're already living outside the law. They're already in trouble. If you were a good Protestant, you'd be in church, nobody's looking. You killed, and they ate a sheep. Now, at this gathering, this meeting, it said that there was many people there, attended by friends and family of the 4 accused, but as well as some local sympathisers. And it's believed that the meeting was possibly a planning session to rescue those that are in prison.
Like to break them out?
To break them out, but not just to break them out, because obviously it's a castle, it's guarded.
Yeah.
The plan was supposedly, allegedly, to murder the warden and set fire to the place.
Ooh.
This was allegedly the plan that was being made at this meeting. Remember, it's Good Friday. You shouldn't even be eating meat, never mind stealing it. It's Good Friday and meat is not allowed. In Christian religions, on Friday, meat is...
We eat fish.
Eat fish, but also, especially, it's Good Friday. So this is a particularly bad Friday. So allegedly the sheep was stolen and eaten, but allegedly that this was actually a planning meeting. This only came to light as part of the trials. But this is illegal. They're non-conformists. They're not in church on Good Friday. I mean, that's a red flag as it is. They're supposedly eating meat. Their relatives are in jail for witchcraft. This is obviously a gathering of non-conformists. So word of this gathering apparently reached the authorities whilst it was in progress, and they rushed to the scene to try and catch, arrest and deal with these gathering of non-conformists. But unfortunately, when they arrived, most of them had already left, leaving behind some family members. They did catch a few, but most of the family members, including the 9-year-old illegitimate daughter, Jeanette.
Oh.
She was one of the ones that was left behind, and she would go on to be one of the star witnesses in the trials that followed.
The pressure, being 9 and being a star witness in the trial to sort of condemn your whole family.
Absolutely. A grandma's in jail, a sister's in jail, a father is dead. On the 27th of April then, 1612, so this is about 2 and a bit weeks later, The inquiry was actually officially held by the Justice of the Peace, John Nowell, along with another magistrate, then Nicholas Bannister, to now determine the reason for this gathering at Malkin Tower. And under questioning, Jeanette, the little girl, implicated and accused her mother, Elizabeth Device, and her brother, James Device, of witchcraft too.
Oh, I bet you the questions were leading.
Probably, and saying your grandma's in jail for witchcraft, your sister's in jail for witchcraft. She says she is a witch. We don't know whether this was a meeting that was supposedly a practical meeting to organise basically a terrorist act of blowing up a castle and murdering, or we don't know whether it was just a gathering of like-minded people
on a holiday.
On a holiday. We don't know, but what Janet was asked, who was there, and apparently she gave a list of names, and apparently to check whether she was telling the truth, the officials, the magistrates, they popped in a name that was just made up, just to test her. And she said, I don't know them. At which point they believed the rest of her list.
Yeah.
They said, well, she did say she didn't see them. They're not real.
I know, but like this girl's 9.
I know, but remember what we said. James I has said children were allowed to be asked about this in a court, and we don't know what brought her to that court. We don't know what they said to her. We don't know whether she was groomed or threatened or even treated nicely to get her to say these things. Oh, don't worry, love, we're not going to hurt anybody, just tell us. But apparently as part of this, she recited what she thought was some sort of spell work, and it was a mixed match of Catholic prayer with other bits of words. So she was obviously getting confused herself. The lines were blurred, and for her, she didn't really understand what she was saying or what she'd heard, I don't think, but they took her list as real.
I mean, at that age, you don't even know what day is what, do you?
No.
Oh, poor girl.
Unfortunately, there's the 4 already currently in Lancaster Castle. There's now 8 more added to the list. So Elizabeth Device, her mum, James Device, her brother, and then Alice Nutter, who was a well-known, wealthy Catholic landowner.
Oof.
See, was she lumped in because she was Catholic and wanted rid of her as well? I don't know. There was Catherine Hewitt, John Bulcock, Jane Bulcock, Alice Gray, and a lady called Jeanette Preston, not the same Janet, a different Janet, and she lived just over the border in Yorkshire. And so she was sent to trial at York and actually was found guilty of witchcraft before these others were sent to trial in Lancaster. She was killed as a witch on the 29th of July, 1612. So she was already dead before the rest were brought to trial.
Started. It happened so quick then.
Absolutely. They didn't wait around. There was about 4 months in between. So in the 4 months whilst awaiting trial, it's not known where the little girl Jeanette was. But she was not arrested. She was not accused of witchcraft herself. And it's possible that she was offered incentives for turning in her family to the authorities. It could be that she was fed. Could be that she was looked after. She must have been somewhere. She must have been sheltered and fed somewhere in the interim.
She used to live in Shit Tower.
Yeah.
So chances are anywhere they put her was probably nicer than Shit Tower.
And you would want to keep your star witness, wouldn't you, somewhere nice and safe. So in August, after 4 months of being in prison, the trial was set to start, and like we said, on the 18th of August, same day as today, 1612. But by this time, old Demdike had already died in prison. She died awaiting trial. She'd obviously succumbed to some sort of illness. She died in prison in that little room, and strangely, they wouldn't necessarily have removed them. So it don't bear thinking about, does it really? So she's died in prison. The people in there with her, they wouldn't have been able to do anything to help her, and they wouldn't have given her any help either.
Now we have human rights for prisoners, even if they've been charged with the most horrendous things, as it should be. But these people weren't even convicted with anything yet, were they?
No, they weren't. The witchcraft trials and witches themselves were deemed treason, and when treason was involved, i.e. you were a threat to the crown, you were kept in jail until trial. So she'd already died. So aside from her, who was already dead, the rest were brought to trial. And all of them, aside from one, confessed to witchcraft. Again, retold their tales, detailed tales of their confessions, how and when they were seduced by the devil, when they were recruited, how long they'd been witches, what demons and familiars they consorted with, who they'd hurt and murdered even with their witchcraft. All of these tall tales were told again, but we have to always remember that these were stories that came from torture. They didn't come from free will. Whether they thought they were witches, they may have still been using that old word, the witchy. They may have still been using that word to describe their business. It was a dangerous word then. You know, they may have been referring to themselves as magical or cunning women, but either way, they may have thought it's one and the same thing. So all of them but one confessed, which was Alice Gray. Alice Gray was actually released without charge after, but she'd still spent 4 months in a horrible prison cell for something that wasn't real.
And that 100% would have affected her health and her mental health.
Exactly. So the way we know about these trials is there was a publication written the year after by a man called Thomas Potts and James Crossley Esquire. He was actually one of the council attendees at the trial. Now, he was really focused on the detail of writing down what everybody said as proof of, I suppose, the charges and what happened. Now, whether he wrote down what they actually said or whether he believed what they said or whether he was just trying to elaborate the stories, but this is the actual publication that we've got that tells us about it. It's really interesting to read, actually. It's called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster. You can read it on the Free Press, Gutenberg.
Oh, I'll find the link and put it in the show notes.
Yeah, really interesting. It was a man that was actually there at the trials, but it was written a year after, so there may be some delay in the information, and whether he could have written down everything properly is one thing. He may have wanted to embellish, he may have changed some of the words. We don't know where truth begins and ends for any of this story. Is debatable, isn't it? So all but Alice Gray, as I said, were found guilty.
I just find it fascinating that one of them was released. You hear about these tests and burnings and all sorts that...
You do. And actually, many people were not killed who were accused of witchcraft throughout the world. This is a really unusual trial in the fact that most of them were killed as witches.
Well, I suppose that's a relief that not everyone was killed.
It's not long after from deciding their guilt to you would go straight to the punishment. So immediately that the trial ends, they were taken up to Gallows Hill in Lancaster. So it's near the castle, where they were hung until dead. Now, we think of hanging as the drop, don't we? They drop, breaking the neck and mostly instant death. Well, this wasn't what hanging was like, especially in witch trials. There was no drop. There was just a small box under their feet, which would be removed. So they couldn't touch the floor, but there wasn't the drop. So their neck was not broken. They basically choked slowly over time. And sometimes it took quite a long time. And you hear of, in this time, not particularly to do with the witches, but in other trials where this method of hanging was used, you hear of family members who would run and pull at the feet to speed it along and finish their loved one's suffering. And their bodies would then just hang there as a reminder on top of the hill to others, as a warning to others. So all of these people, aside from Alice Gray, were killed in this way up on the top of Gallows Hill. And then their bodies were dispensed of there. So they would have likely been buried quite close by, probably thrown together in an unmarked pit. We still don't know now today where the bodies of these family members were, where these people are. We don't know where they are. We think they'd be around in that area, but they don't know. They wouldn't have had a Christian burial, obviously. No respect, no ceremony, no goodbyes from the family, just a slow, painful death after an undignified trial, basically, and torture. So absolutely horrific story. And the area of Pendle is, as you know, still famously associated with witches and witchcraft and ghostly tales of the victims today. The village itself acknowledges its history as a site of terrible tragedy But now it also checks into the tourists that also come for, I suppose, the more traditional Halloween, ghosty, witchy kind of thing. But I struggle to get past that. I struggle to get past the tragedy to the fun. It does help the village, obviously, because it helps with their tourism, and people do come from around the world. But there are sort of two camps of people that come from around the world. There are today's practicing witches who every year on Halloween, they walk to the top of the hill to pay their respects to the people who lost their lives upon.
Well, that's a lovely practice, isn't it?
Yeah. But then there are others that come dressed as your traditional Halloween witches, and then
people actually go there dressed up as witches.
Yes, and it's you take part in the fun. Now, I don't want to rubbish that or make that to be something shameful or awful, because I think it helps the village to be remembered. But it's a little bit.
Okay, so I'm comparing it in my mind to how you can go visit the concentration camps, Auschwitz.
Exactly.
I think it's super important that we do that. It's a bit of a morbid kind of tourism, isn't it? But it's really important in terms of learning these horrible elements of our past so that they're never repeated. But I can't imagine, you wouldn't go to Auschwitz dressed up as a concentration camp prisoner, would you?
When I was a little girl, Dee, and like I said, we didn't live far from this area, that was sort of my first introduction to what I would now sort of see as my spiritual base of being a witch.
Yeah.
But my first thing was visiting those villages and seeing the little witches, and they sell the broomsticks in the shops and they sell the memorabilia, and I was drawn to that as a child. Now that obviously I've matured and I have learned along the way an education about witchcraft and the history and things like this. I've really reframed it for me, so now I can see it in a more grown-up way. But as a starting point, I can kind of understand it.
Any place of significance of religion or spirituality usually gets some element of tourism. I think the thing that just made me was the dressing up.
Yeah.
Maybe not if it's children as part of the fun Halloween thing, but if adults are sort of dressing up as witches to go and visit this place.
There's a lovely museum there, Dee, and you can see all the real sensible kind of story about it. You can learn all about them.
Michelle, when I come up to visit you one day, or if I'm ever up your way, will you take me on a tour?
I certainly will. And, there is one statue of one of these ladies, and there was a man, James, who lost his life as well. There's one statue, and it is of the rich landowner, the Catholic lady.
Of course it was.
Because her family, I think, contributed to the statue. So Alice Nutter, there is a statue of her. And there are still members of the Nutter family living in Pendle today. They still remain on the land. This trial here in Pendle and the notes from the wonderful discovery of witches in the county of Lancaster, these were used as reference for the trials when it came to Salem.
Same patriarchal bullshit.
Yeah. So it's a sad story, but also one of hope that in terms of we can reframe this story as well and remember these people as victims of a terrible time. Unfortunately, the characters in this story didn't help themselves by counter-accusing, but like we said, we don't know the ins and outs of how and why this occurred anyway. So,
like you said, these were poor people. We don't know what they were promised. They were easily manipulated by people who had much more resources and influence than them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It was easy to pit them against each other, wasn't it?
It was. And there are still people in places around the world today accused of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
It still happens today in some places.
Michelle, thank you so much for talking us through that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I hope you will come back.
Really?
All right, here's the deal. You're coming back. You're going to do an episode on Cunning Women, and I'm going to do the Salem Witch Trials. Because
Excellent.
I used to live in Boston, and I've been to Salem, yeah. Listeners, you can't see how we look when we're doing these. We've got our video on, but I was literally sitting there the whole time, riveted, when you had story time at school. So I love the way you tell the stories as well.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'll look forward to next time.
Bye.
If you want lots more fun, moon info, and all things spiritual, plus our merch shop, please visit our website, weknewthemoon.co.uk. And if you want even more, head over to our Patreon page, patreon.com/We Knew the Moon and check out some of our bonus content. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at we.knew.the.moon, and we're also on Twitter at We Knew the Moon 1. See you next time!